Who's had a bad week?
Well, it's only been a month since we last gave the Hungarian government bad week over its pride ban. And I am sorry to tell you that I am back again to give Hungary a bad week. On the bright side, there are extremely tentative signs of a fight back from the EU against Viktor Orbán's latest wrongdoings, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later in this segment, which is brought to you in collaboration with our radio friends from across Europe at Euronet Plus. But yeah, you might have heard about this planned new law in Hungary over the past couple of weeks, although frankly, I still don't think the story is getting the attention it deserves, given how disturbing it is. But back on May the 13th, Hungary's government announced plans for a new law called the Transparency in Public Life Bill, which sounds nice, right? Who doesn't like transparency in public life? Mm-hmm. Very quickly, though, when people started taking a look at what was actually in this law, it became very clear that it is nothing short of an attempt to wipe out any remaining criticism of Viktor Orbán and his government in Hungary, coming from independent groups like human rights organizations, think tanks, and the few remaining independent media outlets who are continuing to work out of Hungary in incredibly difficult circumstances.
I've heard other people referring to this law maybe more accurately as the starve and strangle law.
It's a good description.
But could you tell us a bit about how it actually works, this law?
So what it does is it hands more power to this very sketchy Hungarian government body called the Sovereignty Protection Office that was created about a year and a half ago. And under the new law, any group or organization that receives even a tiny bit of money, like literally a handful of euros from outside of Hungary, can potentially go on a list, a kind of watch list of organizations that have been flagged as foreign funded and having the potential to interfere in Hungarian public life. And once you're on that list, you won't be able to receive any money from abroad unless the government says you can. They're also going to make it really difficult for you to receive donations from people within Hungary too. So effectively, as an organization, if you're on that blacklist, you're cooked, like the government will just make it incredibly difficult to get any more funding and continue operating.
Okay, but you said that groups can only end up in this list if they're seen as interfering in public life, right? Mm-hmm. How are the government defining that?
Basically as anything they don't like. It's an extremely broad definition, and that's one of the terrifying things about it. Under this new law, interfering in public life could include anything from undermining those family values that you talked about earlier. And, speaking in the Hungarian government's language, as well as Italy's one, that would mean any group that fights for LGBTQ rights. It would also include undermining Hungary's Christian culture and indeed criticizing Hungary's stance on the rule of law. So, yeah, if you in any way criticize the state of Hungarian democracy or the lack of it, that can also be seen as interfering in public life.
The irony of that, it really sounds like that in itself is a problem.
Right?
With the rule of law. I shouldn't be laughing.
Yeah, it's quite a warning sign that something's gone very wrong in your democracy if you're trying to prevent that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, even for those of us who've watched Viktor Orbán chipping away at Hungarian democracy for the past decade and a bit, this move is really one of the most breathtaking there has been ever in the whole of that process of Hungary sliding into autocracy. As we've talked about previously, there are elections due in Hungary next year. And at last, there seems to be a serious challenger to Orbán, this former regime insider called Peter Magyar. We don't know for a fact that the elections are why Orbán is doing this, but it does look from the outside like there is a pretty clear push from inside his Fidesz party at the moment to make criticism as hard as possible ahead of those elections. So yeah, this law feels really big and drastic and scary. And Hungarian citizens have recognized it instantly as big and drastic and scary. Tens of thousands of people turned out onto the streets of Budapest to protest against it weekend before last. And one of the most striking sights at that protest was this huge European flag that just said, "Help."
Oh, it's really chilling.
Yeah.
And I guess part of the reason why it feels so scary is because it feels kind of similar to a law that was passed in Russia a while back, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this law has been described as a very close copy of a law that got passed in Russia in 2022. That law was seen as one of the final nails in the coffin for Russian democracy. Not that democracy really existed in Russia by that point anyway, but it basically made any civic activism critical of the government impossible in Russia by labeling independent groups as foreign agents. And of course, Hungary's government is not the first to look at what Russia did with that law and think, oh, that looks like a good idea. I'll have some of that. Georgia adopted a similar law last year. And again, this is one of the milestones on that country sliding towards Russia-style authoritarianism, along with the deeply unfair elections held in October. And even within the EU, Hungary's is not the only government to try this. Slovakia also has a new law targeting civil society that is going to come into effect next month. And the original bill actually started out looking pretty similar to this. The final version of the law has been watered down a bit. It doesn't use this language of describing NGOs as foreign agents anymore. But it does still put a lot of pressure on civil society groups to reveal where their funding comes from. And a lot of Slovak activists are worried that this is a stepping stone to something scarier.
So the thing that Russian bill and this Hungarian bill have in common is that they target groups that get any funding from abroad. Mm-hmm. And presumably a lot of these groups that the government don't like do get at least some of their funding from abroad.
Yeah. So for many years now, as governments like Russia's and Georgia's and Hungary and Slovakia, as those governments have become more and more hostile to criticism and activism of any kind, the groups that do that work have obviously had to look internationally for money to keep them going. And, philanthropic funding that supports stuff like a free press, minority rights, anything that makes a democracy feel noisier and healthier. That money has typically had to come from the countries that promote those values loudly. So that includes notably the US, up until very recently, and also the EU. And by the way, EU funding under this law is going to be considered foreign funding. So if you are, for example, a small theatre group in Budapest that gets even a little bit of EU money to support your work, you are now going to be potentially cut off from that funding and all of your other funding coming from both at home and abroad if the Sovereignty Protection Office decides that your work is critical of the government or dangerous in some way. But yeah, because Orbán and his Fidesz party have made life so hard for anyone critical in recent years, there are a lot of groups like this getting funding from abroad to support their work, whether it is independent media outlets, LGBTQ rights groups, or indeed people doing arts and culture stuff like theatre. The thing about this is that even though this is work that makes Hungary's democracy richer and healthier, it's pretty easy for Orbán to paint it as foreign interference, right? So politicians from Fidesz have pointed to the millions of euros and dollars that have been sent through grants from the European Commission and national European governments and through USAID in recent years. And they are painting this as foreign money that is being used to criticize the government and therefore to intervene in domestic politics. Which is not entirely wrong, right? There is a grain of truth to it. It's just that for those of us who have liberal values, this is kind of good meddling because it helps to keep the few remaining shreds of Hungarian democracy alive. But it's quite clever, cynical timing on the part of Hungary's government because of the context. There has been a lot of concern in Europe about foreign interference in domestic politics lately. Just look at the Russian attempts to influence Romania's elections. Just look at Elon Musk expressing support for the far right in Germany. So the Hungarian government can say, look, all we're doing is protecting ourselves from foreign interference. We thought you were all in agreement that that's a good thing. But of course, that's not what this is. It's very obvious what this is.
Well, as you said, this sounds like one of the most disturbing things that Orbán has done since he came into power a long time ago. Mm. The EU obviously doesn't have the best record in stopping Orbán from doing these anti-democratic things.
No.
But surely there must be a lot of pressure on the EU to actually do something now.
Loads of pressure, yeah. And it is coming from Hungarian civil society itself, of course. It's also coming from elsewhere in Europe. For example, more than 80 newspapers and media organizations from across the continent have written a letter protesting against the law, saying it will basically wipe out whatever free speech is left in Hungary. And the pressure does seem to be pushing the EU into at least words for now, if not action. So that is why I'm giving Orbán's government my bad week. The European Commission does seem to have taken a couple of weeks to think about how to respond to this. But over the weekend, it came out and demanded that Hungary withdraw this law. And a spokesperson for the Commission told Euronews, "We will not hesitate to take the necessary action if this draft is adopted."
Okay, well, necessary action, what does that actually mean?
That is a very good question. So let's take a look at what weapons the European Union actually has at its disposal to try to stop Hungary from doing this. First of all, can they actually get Hungary to drop this law? I mean, legal experts have taken one look at this draft bill and pointed out a variety of ways in which it is very clearly in violation of EU law. And if you are in an EU member country, you're just not allowed to have national laws that break EU ones.
How is it in violation? Like, what exactly is it violating?
Loads of things. So it violates basic principles of the EU that are in our treaties, like the right to free association and the right to free expression. It apparently breaks GDPR, the data law.
Oh.
It also breaks the principle of being able to move funds freely across the EU because it's potentially going to stop Hungarian groups from receiving money from other EU countries.
Oh, yeah. Makes sense.
So it's clearly in breach. The European Commission, which is the closest thing the EU has to a government, it doesn't have the power to just force Hungary to drop this law. What it can do is take Hungary to the EU's court, the Court of Justice. And if you're looking for some positivity in all of this, there is actually an example of this working successfully in the past. The Hungarian government actually already tried to pass a similar law to this back in 2017. It did pass that law, in fact. But the law was found to be incompatible with EU law. And the Hungarian parliament ended up having to repeal it in 2021. So that's kind of promising. Has it stopped the Orbán government from misbehaving in the years since then? No, it hasn't. What a lot of civil society groups are calling on the European Commission to do that they think would be more effective is to fast-track a case that is already going through the Court of Justice against Hungary, which is this case against the 2023 law that created that sketchy body I mentioned, the Sovereignty Protection Office, in the first place. That's the body that's going to be creating this blacklist of NGOs and media organizations. So the European Commission could go to the court and say, look, you're already looking at this case. This situation is developing really quickly. You need to act faster on the existing court case and pass some kind of interim measures to protect Hungarian civil society, whatever those measures may be. Having said that, I said there was a track record of successful use of the courts against Hungary. There are also plenty of court rulings that the Orbán government have just ignored over the years. And it's worth noting that the way that Orbán talks about the courts has been shifting. He's increasingly been talking about something he describes as judicial activism, which is basically like rebelling against a court decision if you think it's wrong. So while I do think the EU does need to go ahead and pursue this legally, I'm a little skeptical about whether it will actually manage to get the Hungarian government to reverse this law, which they're planning to pass by mid-June, by the way. So even if there is going to be legal action, it's probably going to be slow, like way too slow to prevent this bill from actually becoming law.
Okay, so that's the courts, but is there anything else at the EU's disposal that they can do to try and stop Hungary?
Yeah, so other than trying to use the courts, you will probably not be surprised to hear that the other strategy that people are talking about is cutting off Hungary's EU money. Hungary is one of the biggest recipients, the biggest net recipients of EU funds. And the Hungarian economy is also doing terribly at the moment. So that's the big question, right? Can we force Orbán to behave by threatening to take his money away at the time when he really needs it? And again, there is a track record of doing this. About 18 billion euros of EU funding that is supposed to go to Hungary is currently frozen because of anti-democratic behavior by Orbán's government. Again, it doesn't seem to have stopped his government from doing stuff like trying to pass this law, for example. And that is why some within Brussels are calling for more drastic action this time. So last week, 26 members of the European Parliament wrote to the European Commission and called on them to cut off all funding for Hungary. All of it.
Wow. Has that ever been done? Can that be done? I don't think it's ever been done, has it?
No, it hasn't. In theory, it can be done, though. Wow. There is this thing called the rule of law conditionality mechanism, catchy. That's the thing that's previously been used to freeze some of Hungary's funding. And according to all of the clever legal theorists that I've been reading on the internet, you could, in theory, use that mechanism to cut off Hungary's funding completely. And, on one level, it really sucks because that would have a very real impact on ordinary Hungarians who have got nothing to do with their government. But arguably, that's the only thing that's going to work here. We have seen that slicing away bits of Orbán's funding doesn't necessarily have the desired effect. And if we're talking about one of the most extreme things that Orbán has done yet, doesn't that call for the most extreme response? Yeah.
One of the things we've talked about on this show before is the fact that, at least on many decisions, Hungary has veto power. Mm-hmm. And he's used that to kind of blackmail the EU into not cutting off his funding stream. Isn't that just what's going to happen again this time?
Potentially, yes. Just a quick recap. At the start of last year, Orbán did manage to get some of his funding unblocked after basically holding the rest of the EU hostage over its plans to send aid to Ukraine. The EU wanted to send 50 billion euros to Ukraine, and Orbán spied an opportunity to get some of his cash back by saying, I can stand in the way of this. Hungary might be a small country, but you guys need unanimity on this deal, or it isn't getting passed. And it worked. He managed to get about 10 billion unfrozen, even if quite a lot more of it remains frozen. Which is why there is still this ongoing conversation about unanimity, right? In general, this is a feature of the way that the EU is set up that makes it slower for the EU to act on the world stage. And in the specific case of authoritarian leaders within the EU, like Orbán and Robert Fico in Slovakia, it gives them massive leverage and it helps them to get away with this kind of anti-democratic bullshit. Is anything going to change on that front? Well, we are recording this just before lunch on Tuesday. And as we speak, ministers from all the national governments within the EU are meeting in Brussels, and they're discussing this option of potentially taking away Hungary's voting rights. Again, they've discussed this 8 times since 2018, and it's never happened. And I'm sorry to tell you that in this case, it looks very unlikely to happen again. Ironically, because of the whole unanimity thing. In order for one country's voting rights to be suspended, all of the other national governments need to unanimously agree on it. And in this case, Orbán's pal, Robert Fico of Slovakia, has made it very clear that he would block any attempt to punish Hungary.
Well, do you have any hope?
I think something will happen in the courts, probably too slowly. Taking away Hungary's voting rights and therefore Orbán's bargaining power, that seems like a very slim possibility right now. As for the push to take away all of Hungary's EU funding, while I think that a threat to do that is absolutely justified by the extremity of this law, I'm sorry to say it, but I just don't know how much appetite there is for radical action like that within the European Commission and the EU more broadly. I mentioned the forthcoming ban on Pride that you talked about, Dominic, a few weeks ago in Hungary. That has caused a huge amount of protest and criticism. It is horrific that a government within the EU could get away with that level of homophobia. And you mentioned that a lot of LGBTQ Italians have literally left the country and moved elsewhere because the environment is so hostile. It's interesting because the same is happening in Hungary, and it's happening increasingly because the community just feels like nothing is happening to stop Orbán's regime from persecuting them. No one is coming to help. I just want to play you a little snippet of an interview that our friends at Latvian Public Radio aired last week with Luca Dudec, who is a Hungarian LGBTQ rights campaigner.
There is obviously a lot of pressure on the Hungarian LGBTQI community. A lot of people feel very much abandoned and left alone and hopeless by the situation, especially if they are part of the trans community. And a lot of people are leaving the country because they feel like it's hopeless for them to live in peace. Because if you use public transport, for example, as an LGBTQI person, that there is a real chance that you might be discriminated against or harassed.
But despite a majority of EU countries backing a statement saying they want the EU to do something to force Orbán to reverse it, Politico has been reporting in recent days that plans for the European Commission to take action against the Pride ban have stalled because there just isn't enough support from the top ranks of the Commission.
That's depressing. By the way, just sidebar on that, there was news in the Netherlands last week that the Dutch Parliament voted for a delegation of cabinet ministers to attend the banned Pride March in Budapest.
Which is great, but apparently, well, according to Politico at least, ministers from national governments have been encouraged not to attend because it's seen as provocative at a time when apparently the Commission seems to think that a softly approach with Orbán might be better now, that he shouldn't be provoked.
Yeah, I think that's also how the Dutch government actually responded to Parliament's request, but it's still to be seen whether it happens. Oh, grim.
It is. And, you know, from where I'm sitting, it's really hard to see the argument for this softly approach.
Yeah.
It's really frustrating. I would like to see action. And I would also like to see consistent action. You know, if the Commission is potentially going to act on this crackdown on NGOs and the independent media, that's great. But why not also the Pride ban? And while we're at it, if we're talking about consistency, if the EU is going to talk like it's a beacon of human rights in the world, it should also be applying that consistently inside and outside the EU itself. You know, for example, just to give one massive glaring example, when it comes to its dithering over how to approach Israel and Gaza. But yeah, where Hungary is concerned, at least, the tools are there. There are tools at the EU's disposal. I really hope they get used. Otherwise, this is just another moment of, are we really going to let Viktor Orbán get away with this? And this time I feel like if we do, we are going to end up with a country that really, really looks nothing at all like a democracy, sitting within the European Union and potentially vetoing loads of our decisions or threatening to.
When is the election meant to take place next year?
Spring, I believe.
Okay. Will democracy survive another year of Orbán?
Yeah, I mean, it's sometimes hard to feel hopeful. And if you are feeling a little bit helpless and hopeless after that miserable, bad week that I just told you about, please write to your MEP, make your voice heard, tell them that this is something that you care about. And you can also do something with your wallet. In the show notes, you'll find some links for some Hungarian civil society groups and independent media doing great and important work. The window is not yet closed. This bill will not be passed before mid-June, it's looking like. So if you've got any spare cash, please do send it in the direction of these amazing and brave activists in Hungary while they can still actually receive it.